Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our now webinar, Trans Lives Matter, Deadly Patterns of Gender Identity Discrimination in the United States. My name is Sasha Goodfriend. I use she, her pronouns. I'm coming from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm the president of Mass Now, and I'm so thankful that you have joined us from all over the country for this webinar. Our goal today is to learn about one of NOW's priority issue areas from activists on the ground and leave today feeling more educated about the issue and like we know how to take action, and that we've met NOW members from across the country. So please, if you haven't yet, introduce yourself on the chat box. Say your name, your pronoun, and where you are. And I'll read out who we have here so far. We have Natalie Williams from Utah. We have Shatoya Johnson from Holyoke, Massachusetts. We have Marquita from Minnesota and Susan Lee in Tampa. And all right. So Lynette, thank you also from Florida. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to hand it off to Lakey to introduce our fabulous panelists. Lakey's from Florida now, and you'll find in this presentation that a lot of the issues that we're working on in Florida are actually issues that a lot of states are dealing with. And so we're looking forward to discussing more in the Q&A afterwards, how we can learn from each other's organizing strategies and get the work done on the federal level. So with that, I'll hand it off to Lakey. Thank you.
Thanks, Sasha. I'm Lakey Love. I use they, them pronouns, and I am located in Tallahassee, Florida, which is the capital of Florida. I am a member of Tally Now. I am Florida Now. I am the LGBTQIA+ subcommittee chair for Florida Now and the political action chair for Tallahassee Now. It is my delight. I have been out in the queer community since I was 17. My identity has changed along the way, from lesbian to bisexual to pansexual, to cisgender to genderqueer to non-binary, and I identify as pansexual non-binary, and I'm happy to, and actually like very humbled to introduce my two co-presenters. The three of us have battled alongside each other and supported each other through some pretty horrendous attacks, specifically on the trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming community, and have adequately defended LGBTQIA+ communities in the state of Florida together for a number of years and in a number of ways. Kathryn Lane, so Kathryn, if you could just wave, is a brilliant legal mind, an expert, and is an amazing speaker. We have been working together for the past 4 years and have worked in areas around gender identity related issues, including doing trainings on gender discrimination and gender identity sensitivity issues, and have worked with the public defenders and with formerly incarcerated individuals on criminal justice reform related issues, as well as 2.5 years ago now, the state of Florida had the highest trans murder rate in the United States, and most of them occurred in North Florida, and all of them were of trans women of color. And we also worked together on those issues, and you all are going to be delighted to hear Kathryn speak today. Every time she opens her mouth, I listen. Delilah Pierre is a young, passionate, and so Delilah, please wave, passionate, radical. I would say all of us are a radical, but Delilah in her speaking engagements is certainly the one that stirs the pot and gets the crowd going, and has joined now activism at the state legislative as well as local level to combat conversion therapy practices, as well as defeat the anti-trans legislation that came up in Florida this year. She'll be speaking to some of that later on. She, as a young trans woman, does everything from racial justice related issues to police accountability to trans justice and gender justice issues, and is really a representation of the young trans women of color that we need to be listening to and supporting. So whatever she says, you all do. That's my protocol with Delilah. Whatever Delilah says, do, I do. So it is my privilege to introduce them, and you will hear more from them as we get started. Did either of the two of you wanted to add to my introduction? I know that you're both members of local and state activist organizations that I didn't mention that were in your bios. Delilah is a member. What's your position at TCAC, Delilah?
I am outreach coordinator.
Outreach coordinator for the Tallahassee Community Action Committee, and she's done a lot of work on the campus at Florida State University. Kathryn and Delilah and I all co-founded the Florida Coalition for Trans Liberation, which has been around for about 5 months now. And Kathryn is a strong co-founder and endearing member of the Florida Coalition, and also a member of Tallahassee Community Action Committee, and a member of Florida Now and Tallahassee Now, and is on the Tallahassee Now Executive Board. Did that cover it for everybody? Delilah also does a lot of Students for Democratic Society activism. So we will get started by moving to the next. Okay, we just did the introductions without that screen. Right now, we just wanted to make sure that you all were all on the same page with us. So we have worked through some definitions of terms that you hear every day that you may have an understanding of, that you either disagree with our definition, or this definition offers you something to think about, or perhaps you're living in a world where you agree with our definition. But we wanted to bring up alternative definitions so that we could all be on the same page for this presentation, to terms that you'll hear floating around throughout the presentation, and will help us in our discussion for next steps at the end. So we're going to start with sex, and I'm going to let Kathryn jump into sex.
Sure. So we all have kind of an understanding of what biological sex is, based on popular notions. And unfortunately, the popular idea of what biological sex is not what biologists would say it is. The biological definition of sex, as with any category, is one that is socially constructed. People are the ones who invent the criteria for it. But among biologists, they consider multiple different biological characteristics. The common ones that we tend to think about are genitalia or chromosomes, but that is just one small part of the picture when it comes to sex. It includes hormone levels, both internal and external reproductive organs. But perhaps the most important one is the internal sense of sex, which we commonly refer to as gender identity, and that is a sex trait that determines a person's biological sex category. When people are born, the doctor tends to look just at genitalia, just at one of the many factors. And because the doctor isn't saying the whole picture, that assignment is not always correct. Although socially, we do tend to assume that it is. But that assumption is incorrect. That assignment also fails to recognize the existence of non-binary people. Because there are so many different sex characteristics, sex, as biologically understood right now, cannot be considered binary. It cannot just be male and female. It also has to include non-binary people. I think that about covers it for sex. Lakey, do you want to go to the next slide?
I'm trying. There we go. I think I needed to click my screen for some reason. Okay, so I will, I'll tackle gender. Gender, importantly for us, is going to be defined as socially and culturally constructed attitudes or feelings, expressions, and behaviors that in the U.S., and our definitions are really focused on U.S. understandings, right, and not, and specifically in this regard, recognizing that there's multiple different cultures in the United States, but this is a generalization that the U.S. associates with sex classification of male and female. Gender comes in a range of body, identity, and expression categories, including masculine, feminine, androgynous, or a fluid range of all or none of these, and is a blanket category that can be used to speak to a range of genders across a broad spectrum. Do you want to do gender identity and gender expression, Kathryn?
Sure. I mentioned gender identity a minute ago when talking about sex. More specifically, it's a person's internal sense of their gender and or sex. As I mentioned before, it could be within the traditional binary categories of female or male, but gender identity is not limited to those two categories alone. It could be non-binary, could be anywhere along that spectrum, or outside the spectrum. For transgender people specifically, something to remember is that the sex that a doctor assigned us at birth, what the doctor thought we were, is not consistent with our gender identity, what we ourselves know ourselves to be. A common misconception is that gender identity and sexual orientation or sexual preference are somehow connected. It isn't. The gender that you are has nothing to do with who you find attractive. And that's just two different topics.
Right. And it is important also to understand that gender expression and gender identity also don't always have to line up. So in the sense that the way you read my gender expression may not line up with my gender identity. And so these are important things for us to remember as we assume what a person's gender identity is by the way they're expressing their gender, and what the stereotypes that we have about gender expression, assuming that somebody who is expressing a feminine gender has a feminine gender expression is either cis or trans, identified as a woman, and may not be identified as a man or non-binary or gender non-conforming. So it's really important that we remember that these are two distinct categories as well that also don't always overlap in our stereotypes. Okay, I'm going to really quickly, I have a lot of information here and I want to just kind of run through it because we have a lot of information to cover. I think that, and on the broad spectrum, all of us know that, especially trans women of color are singly probably the most discriminated against and oppressed category in the United States. And discrimination is pervasive. It's everywhere. People of color who have multiple discrimination layers are so African American, Black, and Latinx, and other women of color that are trans identified often suffer the most. In the National Center for Transgender Equality's National Transgender Discrimination Survey, poverty, trans people, trans identified people were nearly 4 times higher than the national average. And far too many of them have an income of less than $10,000 a year. 4% of respondents in the National Transgender Discrimination Survey reported attempting suicide compared to the general population, which was 1.6%. That's a staggeringly high rate of suicide. About 1 in every 2 admitted to being harassed or bullied in school. 61%, so almost 2/3, admitted to having been a victim of physical assault and or sexual assault, and 1 in 2 had lost a job due to discrimination and bias. This starts at a really early age, and we see lots of bullying and harassment for gender nonconformity in K through 12 grades. Some of these children and these youth leave school and drop out and never come back because school is so uncomfortable for them. And I don't have this statistic here, but 1 in 3 youth, trans youth, do not go on to college because their experience in high school was so detrimental to their education. They felt so uncomfortable that they felt college was not a choice for them. So I think that all of us can assume and know that in COVID-19 era, that when family situations and school situations, the discrimination and harassment is so high, that we see it coming out in response to high rates of mental health and substance abuse related issues, as well as physical body issues, because the body retains the stress. I mean, I, for instance, have inflammatory bowel disease, and so I have an autoimmune disease, and I'm fairly certain that a lot of it is caused by undue stress because of the battles that I have faced, which are nothing compared to others around gender identity related issues. 90% of trans people said that they had experienced harassment, mistreatment, or discrimination in the workplace, and 26% had lost a job. 1/5 of all trans people who took the survey had experienced homelessness at some point in their lifetime, which is extraordinarily high rate. And 1/5 were denied equal treatment by a government agency and or a government official. Many of them admitted to, like 1 in 2 admitted that they had been verbally harassed or disrespected in a place of public accommodation, and 1 in 5 reported being refused medical care. So that's just the background on the research that we do have. I would like to say briefly before Delilah jumps in on the coordinated attack that happened across the country and here in Florida at the state legislative level, that the research on trans and non-binary people, and in fact, all the stats that I just gave you were for trans people only. There's almost no research on non-binary and gender non-conforming people. There's no funding for it. We're not considered an at-risk category in the sense of civil liberties or civil rights. So there's no state, federal, or local funding usually to help trans and non-binary people, much less do research on how much discrimination is actually happening. And so that report was from 2017, 3 years ago, and I think we all probably know who got installed in 2017, and we can only expect that discrimination against trans populations and non-binary people have exploded, and we'll explain how that has happened. So we can assume that that discrimination information that I just gave you is probably low. It's charted as low compared to what's actually happening on the ground. So I'm going to turn it over to Delilah now, and she's going to talk about the coordinated attack on trans youth in state legislatures across the country.
Yeah, so this year we've seen this attack from Republicans and right-wing forces against trans people that has been implemented on a scale that we really haven't seen before. So House Bill 1635, and I believe it was Senate Bill 1864, I could be wrong about the exact number, but these bills were implemented in the Florida sessions to try to criminalize the life-saving practice of medical care for trans youth. They tried to play it off as if they were trying to help youth and give them autonomy and freedom, as well as kind of showing it as the right of parents to have control over their child. But really what it did was it made it essentially impossible for trans youth who come from abusive or controlling households to have any access to health care before the age of 18. And I think it's really important to remember what Lakey said about this mental stress and mental health of being transgender also relating to physical stress and stress on the body. Thankfully, I've had the access to resources and other things to kind of help me with the physical stress that being trans has caused, but it has definitely caused massive problems with not only my acne, but also I think sometimes these hormonal imbalances that come from people not having access to hormone replacement therapy can genuinely be detrimental to kind of like their physical health, their bodies, their posture, everything else. So as well as this bill trying to be passed with kind of like trying to criminalize this life-saving practice, which is medical care for trans youth, 16 states also considered bills that would ban transgender athletes from participating in activities consistent with their genders. I think often we come upon this topic of whether trans athletes can participate in sports with cisgender athletes, and the excuse we're given is, oh, well, they have an advantage competitively, they'll do better, they always beat them, and they'll point to the one or two trans women who are successful in these events in sports and do place first or second in these events. But I think it's also important to remember that there are also many trans women who run in races with other women and lose, get like 7th place, or do not do well, and that especially after a year on hormone replacement therapy with estrogen, our bodies are the same as any other, as a cis woman's, and so there is no really hormonal competitive advantage at all. As well as to point out how this idea of hormonal replacement and this idea that someone needs to fit into a cisgender category doesn't just affect trans women, it affects all Black women, I think, and all women of color in a sense. I know, I might be getting her name wrong. I think it was Amana Castor, or, well, there's this Black Olympic runner who essentially was told that she needed to pump more estrogen in her body. And this is a cisgender Black woman. Yet she was told she needed to pump more estrogen in her body and that they would need to test her if she wanted to continue running, simply because they didn't think that she had the correct amount of estrogen in her body for a woman. So I think it's important to remember how important it is to fight back against this, because it's not just an attack on trans women, it's an attack on any cis woman who doesn't have what people consider to be the biologically correct amount of estrogen in their body, or the biologically correct kind of body people expect cis women to have. We also fought against this parental rights bill that, again, was kind of pushed with this sentiment that they were trying to help parents, give them more rights over people, but what it really ended up doing was giving parents the right to pretty much exclude conversation about gender identity and sexual orientation in classrooms, even to the point where parents could essentially not give their children vaccines, but also make it so that their children could be excluded from important conversations on history, not just with trans rights and LGBTQ plus rights, but also even with Black history. If a parent wanted to say, I don't want my child to learn about the Civil War, they could pull their child out of that conversation. If a parent wanted to say, I don't want my child to learn about the feminist movement in the 1840s and the 1920s, they could pull that child out of that conversation. So I think it's important to remember how this bill really is acting like it's giving parents rights when really it's stripping children not only of autonomy, but their right to have the basic education and access that they need to understand US history more deeply. I think a lot of what's happening in our country right now is because people are uneducated about what has really happened in our history, about the rights of queer people and trans people, about the rights of women and Black people, and we need to fight against that in any way we can. So those are just a few of the bills that have been targeting trans people and queer people in our state.
Great. Thanks, Delilah. And it's important to know that that was a scaled attack that happened all across the country and was led by very well-funded opponents. So Kathryn's going to tell us a little bit now about the upcoming SCOTUS decision for LGBTQ employment discrimination.
Right now, I'm sure many of you have probably heard about it in the news, there are 3 cases before the Supreme Court that will decide whether queer people have equal rights under federal law. 2 of them involve men who are fired for being gay and will test whether sexual orientation is protected under federal law. 1 involves a woman who is fired for being transgender, and that will test whether gender identity is protected under federal law. Specifically, all of the cases are going to decide whether sex orientation or gender identity fall under the specific category of sex for Title VII purposes. And for anyone who doesn't know, Title VII is the federal law that prohibits employment discrimination based on certain categories, one of which is sex. For a long time, from 1964 and its passage until the 80s, the idea of sex discrimination was something like an employer saying, well, I don't like to hire or promote women, therefore I will not hire or promote you, who is a woman. In the 80s, an attorney, a woman, was denied a promotion, not because she was a woman, but because her appearance did not conform to the employer's idea of what a woman should look like. She didn't wear makeup, she didn't wear dresses, she wore pants, and she didn't have long hair, that kind of thing. She defied sex stereotypes. And the Supreme Court said that that is included within what we mean as sex discrimination, expanding that category under Title VII to mean not just because of your sex itself, but because of sex stereotypes. And that was in the 80s. And about 20 years ago, a legal theory that's being tested now for the queer cases began to percolate in federal courts, began to be tested, and federal courts overwhelmingly accepted them at both the district and intermediate appellate level, at the circuit level. And for trans people, it goes kind of like this. If you as an employer are looking at a woman who is transgender, it doesn't matter if you see her as an insufficiently masculine man or an insufficiently feminine woman. Your failure to promote or hire her or fire her is ultimately coming down to whether she is conforming to your idea of sex stereotypes. And therefore, because it's based on sex stereotypes, it is sex discrimination. For sexual orientation, somewhat similar. Men, there's a stereotype that men will be attracted to women. If a man is gay and is in a relationship with a man, that then defies the stereotype. If you fire a man for being gay, that therefore would be sex stereotype discrimination and illegal. It does have some weaknesses, especially regarding transgender people. specifically because it attempts to tackle oppression by not directly addressing it. And you notice when I was giving the kind of summary, I said it doesn't matter for purposes of the analysis whether you view this woman as a man, or a man as a woman, or a non-binary person as whatever they were assigned at birth. And that's kind of the core problem, because when you fail to directly address the discrimination, it creates sometimes unintended loopholes. For example, during oral argument on the trans case before the Supreme Court, the lawyer representing the woman had to refer to her as a man in order to make the argument, which is really just contributing to her oppression. It is in itself a discriminatory act that her lawyer, someone who is supposed to advocate for her, participated in. Any argument that fails to directly and clearly oppose the kind of foundation of our discrimination, the idea that we are not actually what we say we are, is probably doomed to failure. In a way, the argument that is before SCOTUS is kind of too clever by half. It attempts to skirt the prejudicial attitudes that people have about us and try to get to the goal anyway, of protection under federal law. It's not even that if we had a liberal court, it would be more likely to succeed, because the liberal justices like Ginsburg and Sotomayor during oral argument made comments like, specifically about the female plaintiff. They referred to her as a man who wanted to play for the female team. And that was Ginsburg specifically. And Sotomayor expressed that she thought concerns about women like myself and Delilah are legitimate in terms of working with us in an employment environment. Those are both very discriminatory statements. They evidence a kind of internal prejudice that even the liberal justices have. That being said, it is a highly conservative court right now, and the Supreme Court is expected to rule against transgender rights. We are likely to lose. The legal theory that we've all been relying on for the past 20 years is probably going to go up in smoke. That has a number of negative effects. They will probably justify their decision by saying, well, Price Waterhouse was wrong, and sex stereotype discrimination doesn't count under Title VII. That's going to affect everyone, not just transgender women, transgender men, non-binary people. It's going to affect cisgender women as well, and cisgender men. We will be back in the days where an employer can legally say, I don't think you're wearing enough makeup. I think that your hair needs to be longer. I don't think that you should be wearing pants. And that will be a legitimate thing for them to base employment decisions on. And even though it has been illegal, that's certainly not something that employers have necessarily even shied away from. Even within the legal profession, as recently as just 10 years ago, 2010, at a continuing legal education seminar, a female judge instructed all the female attorneys that when you are in court, you're effectively committing malpractice if you're not wearing a skirt and not wearing makeup. So the attitudes have always been there. Having the federal legal protections has done work in holding it back. But now that the Supreme Court is going to be giving the stamp of approval to all that, for all of us, it's really a darker day, I think. And it also has a widespread effect, not just in employment, but because the definition of sex in Title VII is used to determine the definition for other federal statutes and for the Constitution, like Title IX, the Equal Protection Clause, all of which address different areas of potential discrimination. It's going to apply in the education context. It's going to apply in the context of what local, state, and federal governments can do as well. And let's assume that the legal issues around the ERA are settled. It becomes part of our Constitution. The ERA refers to sex, and because SCOTUS is about to poison that term, regardless of the biological definition actually being very inclusive of everyone, because SCOTUS is about to poison the legal definition, the ERA, even if it becomes part of the Constitution, it will be undercut. In terms of the timing with COVID-19, we are already on the very edge in terms of employment. Many of us have to seek employment already in kind of underground economies. That is only going to get worse once the Supreme Court approves of employment discrimination against us in the COVID-19 era. It will be perfectly acceptable for an employer to hang a sign saying, no transgender people need to apply. Yeah. And if we already employed somewhere and cuts need to be made because of a budget, because of COVID-19, it will be perfectly legitimate for us to be the first to go. It's a topic that I wish I could say something positive about, but there really isn't anything, with the exception of one small thing. There is an alternative argument that can be used, at least in some contexts, to support transgender rights at the federal level. It has very little authority within the federal court system, but it does have some. It involves, instead of shoehorning us into sex discrimination under Title VII, it involves recognizing us as a separate category, a quasi-suspect class under the Equal Protection Clause. That would only apply under the Equal Protection Clause to actions by government, state, local, and federal. It would not be as wide-reaching as Title VII, but it would be something. Basically, that's all we have to look forward to right now is an official stamp of approval that we are second-class citizens and not a lot to hold on to legally.
Thanks, Kathryn. Were you finished? Did I cut you in? Okay. On that solemn note, I told you all that when Kathryn speaks, we all listen. Same with Delilah, right? I'm going to run through this really quick for time's sake. Some of you may have seen it already. Since Trump was elected, 67 policy attacks have happened. 67 attempted policy attacks and 65 which were passed and initiated. Anti-trans and anti-LGBTQIA plus policy attacks were put into place, depleting discrimination clauses. The most recent was on May 8th. The Department of Health and Human Services pushed a final rule eliminating the collection of sexual orientation data for youth and foster and adoptive parents. Others include things like the trans military ban. In the first month in office, the first attack, the anti-LGBTQIA plus attack that Trump put into place was to remove federal protections for trans youth in K through 12 schools and give a free pass to bully, harass, and basically all out torture trans youth in K through 12 public schools. We've seen proposed rule changes that have been put into place and passed where massive federal agencies like the Department of Justice are allowed to openly discriminate against people on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity. These areas is like everything from Department of Health to Department of Labor to housing, employment, and we've seen a massive support. Of course, our VP is like the leader of conversion therapy and anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, has a personal hate for trans NB people. And the current attack holds true. Just about 4 weeks ago, President Trump's which is really in this regard, right, as much the Pence administration as it is the Trump administration, because we all know that that the Pence administration is leading the way on the attack. That to remove the hard one, and we always people tend to want to say that we call the Affordable Care Act Obamacare, and we tend to want to attribute these protections to President Obama because a lot of the protections were won while President Obama was in office. But I think it's really important that you all hear today from trans and NB activists that trans people have been fighting discrimination, and we like trans women of color like Delilah were the foundation of the LGBTQ movement, right? And have led the way always, and fought on their own behalf for their own defense. And so those discrimination, anti-discrimination, and non-discrimination clauses were gained through blood and sweat and tears, and through activists doing work at local, state, and national levels. And what Trump is doing right now is removing provisions that were put into place by Congress and approved by President Obama in the Affordable Care Act that supplied protections, non-discrimination protections, specifically including gender identity, to protect trans and non-binary people from discrimination in healthcare. And he's doing this in the middle of a COVID-19 global pandemic. So what we're about to see, it hasn't happened yet, which gives us some room for battling, which is our next major and final topic before we open it up to discussion. And I will just have to remind Delilah if we can run through these really quickly, because we don't have very much time and we want to get to question and answer, and we only have 15 minutes left to this webinar, that we have some suggestions for organizing around these issues to help address the problems. And then we also want to open the floor for other people's ideas and suggestions around these problems, including the pending attack to remove discrimination protections on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation, which would allow healthcare providers to deny healthcare to patients on the basis of their gender identity, which is a problem in COVID-19. So it's a problem irregardless, but it's a deadly problem now more than ever before. So I'm gonna shut up and let Delilah run through our suggested solutions, and then we'll open the floor with Sasha leading. Oops, I didn't mean to do that, sorry. Can you still read them, or do you want me to jump up the slideshow?
I can still read them, and I will run through them quickly. So some solutions, some happy things that can hopefully help create positive change in our communities and the places we're in. We think that the The state now and the local now chapters need to pass resolutions against the SCOTUS decision and or Trump removal of ACA protections. We want local chapters to work in conjunction with trans-led groups or LGBTQ plus people and their own membership to install or protect local human rights ordinances. And this is important even if that group's direct action or organizing isn't totally related with just trans people, like the Tallahassee Community Action Committee is a direct actions group, but we worked with now on these queer and trans issues, even though we're not totally centered on trans or LGBTQ plus rights. We want national, state, and local now to organize in conjunction with trans-led groups and pass a state-level patient of bill rights or state Department of Health non-discrimination clause that includes gender identity and sexual orientation. And we want now to focus on gender justice that is all-inclusive and not just about cisgender women. Because it's important to remember, again, one, an attack on trans women, an attack on non-binary people is an attack on cisgender women, because they want you to fit into the smallest boundaries of womanhood that they can. And every time they attacked us, they're closing these boundaries of what womanhood is going to be tighter and tighter on cisgender women as well. It's important to recognize that non-binary people also experience misogyny, even if they might not personally identify as women. It's important to understand the nuances and the way misogyny impacts transgender women versus cisgender women versus non-binary people, on how gender justice needs to be all-inclusive if we want to create the broadest boundaries of womanhood we can and give everyone who fits in it the right to exist as freely as they'd want to be. And now we're open to take any suggestions y'all have.
I love it. Let's give our panelists a round of applause virtually. I want to highlight some things that I noticed. One, that trans rights is a feminist issue because it's a human rights issue, of course, but also it's an issue of gender discrimination, clearly. And so if it's not immediately on your feminist agenda, then make sure it is. Also, there's policy attacks happening on all different levels in terms of state departments, state legislation that's being coordinated federally, also federal legislation, and the Supreme Courts. So we need to be vigilant on all of those counts, and working in solidarity with trans-led organizations is the other part that you mentioned in the end, to make sure that organizations like NOW are doing. So I think Florida is a great example of what that coalition work can look like in solidarity. In Massachusetts, we also have a strong partnership with the Transgender Emergency Fund, which is the only organization helping low-income trans individuals in Massachusetts, and that's how we are working in partnership. So for other states that are listening in, if you don't already have organizations to work with, make sure that you do. Do any folks listening have questions that they want to start with? You can either unmute yourself or put them in the chat box.
I guess I just wanted to say real quick, over here in Utah, this state is, pretty much no support in trying to get trans people and non-binary people access to healthcare, access to sex education, and what that looks like in their context. And so something that a lot of activists that I know over here were supporting specific organizations who do that. So like Planned Parenthood, for example, they work really hard to make sure that trans people, people of color, non-binary people, and just disenfranchised people have those rights and opportunities. And so while we are working on the federal level, a lot of us activists are focusing on the specific organizations that are doing the most. So yeah, that's what I have to say.
I love it. Thank you so much. Yeah, I see that Marquita put in the comments that gender equality is one of NOW's core issues. So doing coalition work needs to happen on this local, state, and federal level. It can't just happen in a nutshell. And so hopefully all of the organizations like Planned Parenthood that you're working with also have local, state, and federal networks to be collaborating with too.
And to add to that, just to say really quickly, if y'all live in Florida or know anyone, recommending them to join the incredible group, the Florida Coalition for Trans Liberation, that Lakey and Kathryn created is a great start to helping us organize.
In Minnesota, we have Gender Justice, and we do a lot of things with them.
That's awesome. Any other questions from folks? A question.
This is a broad question. Do most of you all have HROs in your human rights ordinances that are gender identity inclusive where you live?
We're in the middle of a virtual state conference where the bylaws are being changed to include that.
That's a great point. MassNow did do a review of our bylaws and all of our organizational text in 2016 to be inclusive of all genders and explicitly trans inclusive. It needs to be explicit, I think, for all organizations. It can't be implicit. That's like step one in a way, is doing the internal work, I think, for an organization by like reviewing your current documents. And then two, also taking the time as leadership of an organization to learn and do trainings, and then working in coalition, all happening at the same time.
Right. My question was actually specific to local or like local municipalities. So, right, Kathryn and Delilah and I all live in Leon County, Florida. We have a human rights ordinance that includes public accommodations. So as long as we don't travel outside of Leon County right now, at least legally on the books, I don't know how enforceable that is, and there's not very many cases enforcing it. We couldn't be denied healthcare on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation because trans and LGBTQ advocates battled really hard in 2010 to pass a human rights ordinance, and we have one that's countywide. And my question was, in the other locations that people, because what we found around organizing, specifically for in planning the organizing and trying to strategize around organizing, anticipating the removal of protections in the Affordable Care Act and the removal of protections within the Health and Human Services at the federal level, that we would be inherently reliant upon state and local ordinances for protections and or individual healthcare providers to have non-discrimination clauses. And we thought to go try to get our own Department of Health to pass a non-discrimination clause, and found that we couldn't find any states really that had departments of health. I don't even know if that's the right term, but have Department of Health departments, I guess is the right way to put it, that have non-discrimination clauses. There were some states that had passed Patients' Bill of Rights that included gender identity and sexual orientation, but our state in particular, in Florida, is never going to pass that, especially not in the COVID-19 era. And so we're trying to figure out how to organize in other ways, and that's why we asked to put in the suggestions to have local now chapters work, because that's the provisions that we're suggesting in Florida, is to go to your city council or city commission or county commission or county councils or whatever you have that had passed an HRO, and have them pass a resolution that reaffirms the HRO in COVID-19 era, and then also so they're upholding their own HRO and then making a broad statement against the removal of gender identity, in particular discrimination clause at the federal level, so that our local municipalities and state governments are speaking up against what's happening at the federal level. Those were our suggestions, and we were just looking to see if there were other people in other states that had won successes or had maybe different ideas on how to organize around that, which was what led to my question.
I totally understand that. I did not understand that before. So in Massachusetts, we had the Yes on 3 campaign a couple of years ago, which was, so the legislature passed anti-discrimination to make it illegal to discriminate based on gender identity. And then a right-wing group put it up on the ballot to be voted on, so that it was the first time in the country people were voting on if it was okay to discriminate against trans people. And luckily the bill, the vote failed in terms of the ballot initiative. The ballot initiative failed. We won. So it maintained, but it was intense, I think, to be doing this work in Massachusetts because we feel so much like in the city, we're in a blue bubble. And yet our state is much more purple, and we had to do, they did market research. I don't know, if you look on Freedom Massachusetts, you could probably find, they did a really incredible organizing campaign to talk to anti-discrimination policies for people who are on the fence. Also, I saw in the comments that Susan Lee said the city of Tampa, both several years ago, we finally got Hillsborough County to come into the 21st century a few years ago.
But you just lost your conversion therapy ban. Florida. Ooh.
And that's another bill that we just had passed this past year in Massachusetts to ban conversion therapy that we've been working on for decades. And it was really challenging to pass because legislators said that it wasn't happening, or they couldn't find stories of it happening. But also when it did pass, and it was the only LGBTQ bill in the legislative session in Massachusetts, the governor didn't do a bill signing for it. We have a Republican governor. He's one of the most popular governors in the whole country. So that was like a snide pass.
And I see a comment in here from Margarita that equality, or from, I'm losing who it was, from Susan Lee, that Equality Florida had helped 65% of the state covered, have local HROs, and that's in Florida. I just want to say, from my own experience with I actually worked for Equality Florida. Both Kathryn and I were on Equality Florida's transaction team. That it's really important that we understand when we talk about these sort of things that all, not just the one in Leon County or the one in Jacksonville, all of those HROs were actually passed and pushed by local activists, and Equality Florida helped in small ways. But Equality Florida was not the incentive behind why Leon County has an HRO, nor were they an incentive behind why we have a local conversion therapy ban. Those were local activists like Delilah and Kathryn and I. And the reason why I say that that is important is because often as activists, we think we should just leave it up to a larger not-for-profit organization to do the work. And yet volunteer activism is what gets things done, right? Local, directly impacted volunteer activists are the ones that push those HROs. And in fact, Equality Florida is in the ringer right now because they're part of the reason why Jacksonville just lost their HRO. So, because they took legal advice from lawyers that were tied in with Equality Florida. So we need to be careful. Equality Florida does good work, but we need to, I think all of us understand the power of local activism and individual volunteer activists, which is what NOW runs off of, and which is where I've seen all of the change in Florida come from. So big money, not-for-profit organizations have not made sustainable change and are not taking the lead. And it's up to us as activists to take the lead at the local, state, and national level. And that's where all of you are just critical. Each one of us has power, and together, like I know that Kathryn, Delilah, and I together are a powerhouse team that nobody in our local area wants to mess with. Our county commission, our city commission, they all know who we are. When we walk in together, they sit down and listen, and we are all unpaid activists. All of this research, everything that you just heard today, doesn't come from a paid position. It comes from people that were directly impacted, that are fighting on their own behalf and the behalf of directly impacted people across the country. So I thank you for that comment, but I also want to recognize that 65% of Florida has an HRO because local activists stood up and fought for it. That was a little soapbox, I'm sorry. But I feel I know Delilah does too, and I know Kathryn does too. I think that all of us feel very strongly about the power of local people power, right? And not for-profit power, but people power.
Another thing that,
go ahead.
I just wanted to add, I really think, although of course I think the focus is on, for all of us who know and understand how important the struggle for trans rights is, showing our empathy and solidarity with trans people and truly fighting for them. But what we have to really get, I think, feminists and cis women to understand is that, like, the fight for trans right is essential for keeping their own rights. We have to make them understand that it's within their literal self-interest to support us in our fight for trans rights. Because every single time they come for trans people's rights, they're coming for cis women's rights too. Because when they come for trans people's rights, what are the arguments they use and the statements they use? Oh, we're too masculine, we're too this, we're too that. What they're saying is, you don't fit into the boundaries of what it means to be a woman. And each time they are successful in this argument, they shorten the boundaries of what it means to be a woman again and again. And that really hurts cis women as well, because anytime you're wearing pants, anytime you're a little bit more masculine than they expect you to be, anytime, we know that 25% of people assigned female at birth just are born with like hormonal changes with more testosterone in their bodies and other things. Like, any people like that, even if they identify as a cis woman, are affected. So I really want us to understand, like, we need to fight for trans rights because it's within the literal self-interest of cis women.
Yes, love it.
And I have to jump off because I have another call and I'm hosting at 4:30, but I know that Kathryn was about to say something and I just wanted to hear or listen, and then I have to say goodbye. It doesn't mean the rest of you do. I just, unfortunately, I'm obligated elsewhere.
Kind of adding on to what Lakey said about larger organizations and how that can kind of lead to problems like with Jacksonville's HRO. The weaknesses in the argument that I identified that's before SCOTUS right now that we're all kind of waiting on, and it's going to affect all of us, and likely in a very negative way. The problems with the argument is because tactical decisions were made by national organizations, not to kind of compromise on whether to go full throttle on trans rights, and specifically by relatively small groups of lawyers who aren't necessarily connected to the community, and definitely were not connected to the community 20, 15 years ago when the argument started getting steam within the federal courts. And that is something that we're all going to pay the price for. As Delilah pointed out, we are rising or falling together.
That's right.
There's no difference.
Right. And I think I want to add a point that Kathryn and I had discussed earlier today before getting on this call, which is that trans men and trans masculine identified people are also impacted and are trans identified. And so we've been talking a lot about trans women and cis women and non-binary people, but I want to make sure that people understand that when we talk about gender justice, that we're also talking about trans masculine people and trans men because they're discriminated against. And even though in some ways they have male privilege or patriarchal privilege in some areas, they still suffer broadly because they're trans identified. And so that we need to make sure that we're all inclusive in that area as well, that basically gender justice is about fighting for people who are, and it's more than just equality, right? It's equity, because as we saw, there's so many trans identified people that are living off of below 10,000 a year, that economic justice overlaps here in incredible ways. And we don't get insurance and can't get trans affirming healthcare because of we don't have trans affirming insurance. This is an economic issue, right? As much as it's a gender justice issue. And so this is super important, and I'm so glad that you all are here today. And I know that you might continue talking, and I just want to say thank you to everyone, especially to Sasha, Delilah, and Kathryn. Every time I get to work beside you all, I'll walk away feeling empowered and inspired, and I'm ready to fight. And somebody put, I think it was Margarita's, put, even if we're aggressive, and I'm like, hell yeah, we're gonna get aggressive too, right? because the aggression that's coming at us is high, right? So sometimes we just have to like fight back in strong ways, and I think the big point is sticking together so that we fight arm in arm. And so I'm going to have to say goodbye. Thank you to everybody. But please get our information from Sasha, and we're happy to continue this discussion off this webinar and explore ideas for future actions caused by or escalated by what the ideas that were discussed here. That's the point. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. I have to head out too, so we can all do a wave together, and I will stop recording.
Thank y'all.
I'll send out the video also to everyone who RSVP'd.